Coming into this week's game, a lot of Louisville fans are torn. How good are the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets? Well, what better way to answer that than to bring an expert into the show today?
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Card Nation, what is going on, everyone? Welcome into this special Tuesday edition of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. I want to take this time to personally thank you all, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. Joining us for the Georgia Tech game week, none other than publisher of the Sports Illustrated Georgia Tech site, Jackson Caudell. Jackson, welcome back to the show, man. How are you?
Appreciate you having me back on. It's a little bit different than, I guess, where we were at this point last year, but making my first trip to Louisville ever this weekend, so I'm excited about that. I will be at the game on Saturday, but definitely excited for the game.
Hey, there we go. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the show, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Brought Jackson on to answer the questions that the Louisville fans want to know about. There's a lot of, kind of back and forth as to how good are the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets. If you're looking for the start of the season to be an indication, that in itself, the win against Florida State looked like a marquee victory when they won back in Ireland. Now it seems like Florida State is bottom of the ACC. Tough bout in Syracuse. Looked like they just ran out of time. But overall, Jackson, 3-1 to start the season. What's sort of been the initial thoughts on this installment of Brent Key's squad?
So I think in a way we're still finding out because, like you said, it looked like they had landed maybe the biggest victory of his short tenure here. But obviously, and it's a little unfair to them, but, Florida State looks really bad right now. The wins against Georgia State, and again, no disrespect to them, but wins against Georgia State and VMI are not going to move the needle, of course. And, the defense took some lumps against Syracuse. So overall, I would still say this weekend is also going to be finding out more about Georgia Tech, but I'll say I think it's an improved team from last year. It's still a very flawed team. There's still some holes there that obviously Syracuse exploited and that they're going to have to cover up if they want to have a chance to win on Saturday.
One thing I found interesting was just, and I'll be honest with you, a lot of people have kind of gotten on me for how high I am on Georgia Tech, at least coming into the season. I had Georgia Tech as the number 2 trap game, a game that Louisville should win. But you saw last year, you take a quarter off and boom, you're down by double digits. Brent Key brought back, it feels like the vast majority of the starting lineups, especially on the offensive side. What would you say are sort of the main strengths that you've seen from Tech's squad through the first 4 games of the schedule?
Well, I think most people will know that they brought back most of their offense, which was very, very good last year. And their identity is wanting to be physical and run the football. I'm sure everybody's seen the viral Brent Key meme of running the football, after the Florida State game, all that kind of stuff. But they pride themselves on being physical up front, having a tough running game. I think the thing that's made their offense is a whole lot more efficient this year because Haynes King is not turning the ball over. He's got pretty much one poor throw all season against Georgia State. He threw an interception, but last week he was as perfect as you could possibly be, although it was against a weak opponent. But they really want to be physical on the lines of scrimmage on offense, and they have made a concerted effort to be much better in stopping the run. The run defense was probably the worst in the country last year. It was in the 120s last year. It's better this year. It's not like they're not Ohio State or anything, obviously, but they're a lot better than what they were a year ago. Now, a couple of the flaws, as I'm sure we'll get into, the pass rush and, some going against strong passing attacks, I still think is a concern. But I would say just being physical on the lines of scrimmage is definitely the identity of this team.
Now, looking down the barrel of the schedule, it's safe to say that Georgia Tech didn't really get spared. There's some tough matchups, and it feels like Louisville's sort of the kickoff for the tough stretch. Duke still to be determined. North Carolina, same thing. But you've got Notre Dame, Virginia Tech, Miami, NC State, and Georgia to round out the schedule. It feels like this is a better Georgia Tech team than last year. But realistically speaking, I mean, you're sitting at 3 wins right now. How do your expectations for this team now in terms of win-loss, how does it sort of match up with what you may have thought before the season?
So a couple of points. So before the season, I had them going 7-5, and this was actually their first loss. I did pick them to beat Florida State even before the season, knowing how bad they were. This was kind of where I thought they might slip up. So on that, I think in a way their schedule, it still is very hard. Like obviously Georgia and Miami are coming at the end, but there are some games that looked very hard, but NC State looks bad right now. Does that mean Georgia Tech's going to win that game? Not necessarily, but like they look bad right now. Virginia Tech lost to Vanderbilt. Notre Dame lost to Northern Illinois. Right now, and I still think as good as Miami looks, they've also not played anybody. Like to be perfectly fair, like the only game I look at is just they're probably definitely not winning right now is Georgia. The rest of them, while they're going to be underdogs in a few of them, like I don't think there's anybody I can guarantee you that it's unbeatable. I think that's a bit of a shift from years past where you look at that and it's like, they're probably not going to win. And, coming into this game, Brent Key is 5-0 against ranked ACC teams, 4 of those wins coming on the road. So they do have that going for them. But, yeah, the schedule is still tough, but I do think it looks a little less imposing than maybe it did just a month ago.
I find it pretty interesting, Jackson. FanDuel obviously being the title sponsor of this show. If you go to FanDuel.com and look at the line for this game, currently I was surprised. I wasn't expecting Louisville to open up as a 10.5-point favorite in this one. First initial thoughts on Georgia Tech being double-digit underdogs in this contest.
So I co-host the Believe Georgia Tech podcast, and me and my buddy were talking behind the scenes, what's going to be the line for that? And this was before the VMI game. And I said, I think it could be double digits. And they were all just kind of surprised. But it's not super surprising to me. I think the main pushback people are going to have is Louisville's played Jacksonville State and Austin Peay. So how do we know how good they really are? I think in terms of on paper and talent, I think Louisville is probably clearly the better team. The fact that it's on the road. And I do think this is just my opinion. The Syracuse game, I think, shifted some things in favor of that because, as we all know, Louisville can throw the football around. They're good at running it too, but like Louisville, Jeff Brom's as good of an offensive coach as you're going to find in the country. So there's still some questions, I think. And then, the Florida State win has kind of lost some steam as well. So I think there are still some questions okay, Georgia Tech's pretty solid, but are they really good? So I think that does play into it. But no, I wasn't super surprised.
I'm going to kind of turn this around, I should clarify. And I wasn't originally going to answer this, but I find it intriguing that, and maybe, again, this might go back to me being a little bit higher on Georgia Tech and maybe a little bit of last year sort of tainting my viewpoint on things. But with you sort of not being surprised that the line is as large as it is, I feel compelled to ask, what are your sort of thoughts on this Louisville team they hear from me, and as unbiased as I try to be, I'm still biased in nature. So what are your thoughts, quickly on what is this Louisville team looking like? Like, what are your thoughts on the Cardinals?
Yeah, and me not being surprised so much at the line is more me just being higher on Louisville. Like, I think Louisville is probably unquestionably my third best team in the ACC right now behind Miami and Clemson. And we're still getting more data on them, of course, but I think just I think their defense worries me a little bit, and the fact that they can create havoc a little bit, and just seeing Syracuse was shredded against Ohio, and then they got really physical with Georgia Tech, and I think it surprised everybody to see that. I think there's a little sticker shock there of what Syracuse was able to do, and then I can list a ton of guys on Louisville that worry me, especially in the front seven. Like, they create a lot of havoc, get pressure on the quarterback, right. And then as I was saying, like, Jeff Brom watching that Syracuse tape probably had to be thinking, like, man, like Tyler Shuck could throw for like 350 on these guys. And a lot of that has to do with the pass rush. Like, I still think there's just the worst matchups for Georgia Tech when they play strong passing attacks. Now, and we can get into this in a little bit, I think there is an argument whether maybe Syracuse has some better weapons than Louisville. And I think that's just more of like Syracuse has some dudes at wide receiver and tight end. But, I think that's got a little bit to do with it. But I think Louisville is just a very strong all-around team with not a ton of apparent weaknesses. But, again, I'm still kind of waiting to see. Like, this Saturday is going to tell me a whole lot of what I want to know about Louisville.
Yeah, and that's sort of why I'm cautioning fans to really get up in arms about people putting Louisville a little bit lower down, like ACC power rankings, because it just doesn't matter right now. I mean, you've played two mid-major FCS opponents, non-power five, but overall, I'd like to get a little bit more in depth in terms of analysis on this Georgia Tech offense, because I'll bring up, there's one aspect of this offense that scares a lot of Louisville fans, and we'll tell you what that is coming up on the next segment of Locked On Louisville. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by ROY. That stands for Return on You, and it's making a new platform that lets you, the fans, get involved in NIL like never before by making contributions directly to your favorite athletes. ROY allows fans to directly back their favorite college football athletes. With ROY, fans can play a key role in shaping the future of their favorite teams while athletes maximize their name, image, and likeness. Fans' contributions are securely held and are only distributed if the athlete makes the decision that aligns with the fan's support. If not, the money is returned to the fan. So download ROI for iOS or Android and enter the code LOCKEDON. That's locked space on. And you'll automatically be entered into a sweepstakes to win $5,000 cash. Join Roy.com for additional details. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited. Get off the sidelines and into the NIL game with Roy. Support the players and change the landscape with Roy. And back into the second segment of this Tuesday edition of Locked On Louisville. Georgia Tech Sports Illustrated publisher Jackson Caudell joining us for the second season. If you don't remember, he actually joined the show before the 2023 campaign, which actually feels like 5 years ago, honestly. But Jackson, there's one aspect of this offense, and it's more so not even just Georgia Tech, but sort of an underlying theme, is that Louisville struggles containing mobile quarterbacks. And that was an issue last year in this game, and we know how Haynes King is at his best when he's improvising. So when you look at the passing numbers, not anything to write home about, but then you compare them with the rushing numbers as well and combine those, it feels like Haynes King is starting to take that next step forward. Is it sort of the situation where, okay, you're going to have to stop the run, and if you start to do so, we'll throw the ball? Like, what's the offensive tendencies of how Georgia Tech operates?
So it sounds a lot more. It's a little bit more complex than how I'm going to say, but it's running to set up the pass. Like, I think I noticed it last week, and I talked a little bit about it. Is like they did not run Haynes King at all last week, and you don't need to against VMI. And I agree with you. Is like Louisville struggled to contain some mobile quarterbacks. Like I think he could run a lot this weekend, but I think it's running to set up the pass. And like a lot of people maybe not realize that Georgia Tech has a ton of speed at receiver. Like Malik Rutherford is incredibly good after the catch. He's not the biggest guy, of course, but like he is very good with the ball in his hands. They use a lot of quick screens. They try to get him the ball in any way they can. And Eric Singleton as well. He caught a touchdown against Louisville last year. Super fast player. He had 100 yards in the first half last week. He had a rushing touchdown against Georgia State. He's another guy. They're just going to try to get the ball in his hands, whether it's running, whether it's throwing the ball deep downfield. Like that's Haynes King's go-to guy when he's throwing deep. Chase Lane is another guy at receiver that they really utilize. Christian Leary's a speedy guy as well. And then Jamal Haynes out of the backfield. But they are going to run to set up the pass, and they use a lot of misdirection. Like Buster Faulkner, I think he's one of the best offensive coordinators in the entire country. Just what he's done with this unit, just a short amount of time. If anybody can remember what Georgia Tech was before he got there, like I think you would probably agree. But yeah, it's running to set up the pass, utilizing motion, and using the speed to your advantage, because like Georgia Tech can burn you deep. Like don't make any mistake about it.
I found it interesting. There was a lot of questions coming into this matchup last year about, well, how good is this offensive line going to be? And I remember you making a point of emphasis to suggest that, like, hey, I think that this line is a little bit better than maybe people are being led to believe. And it looked like you were right throughout the season. I mean, Tech's offensive line at times looked really good. They bring some pieces back. Going up against this Louisville pass rush led by Ashton Gelati, how do you feel about Tech's ability to keep Haynes King upright this week?
Well, Haynes King has not been sacked this year, so I do think, and a lot of it I think is they do try to get the ball out quickly in against some defenses. Now I'm interested to see, because the last time we saw them against like a legitimate like team in Syracuse, like Syracuse was kind of beating them up front, and they got some pressure on King, and that mostly it was stopping the run. Mm-hmm. But I'm very intrigued to see how they bounce back from that, because I think they've been challenged ever since then, because I do think they kind of got punched in the mouth a little bit, weren't expecting it. Like now they know Louisville is a very, very good front seven, and they're going to have to do a really good job of protecting Haynes King. But it all starts up front. Like if they can protect Haynes King, open some holes in the ground game, like I do think they have a chance to score some points on Saturday.
13 rushing touchdowns this season. And what I find most impressive is that you have 3 dudes with at least 3 rushing touchdowns. Now, one of those being Zach Pyron. I mean, you have Jamal Haynes and Haynes King with the ability to run the football. I guess if you have to look at this game and you look at, if you can't choose Haynes King as the player to watch for on offense, who are you going with? Are you going with Jamal Haynes? Is that the easy answer? Or are you going with more so of a receiver trying to, open this thing up?
So I'll take the easy answer out, and I think it's just because of his performance in the last 2 games. I'll say Jamal Haynes, because I still think there's some uncertainty behind him. Like one of the storylines for Tech we've been covering pretty much since spring is like, okay, last year you had Dante Smith, who went off to the NFL, ran out of eligibility, was a really good number 2 back. They've rotated a lot of guys in there, and they just have not been able to find that one guy. And he's for his standard, not been great. He only had 30 yards rushing last week against VMI. He only had 7 carries. Like they were not trying to give him a heavy workload last week. But against Syracuse, he really had a tough time getting anything going. He had a touchdown late in the game. But just for his standards, he was an 1,000-yard rusher last year. I think he's an all ACC caliber of player. I think, if he can't get going, I think you're just putting a lot of pressure on Haynes King to throw it around. And, I think he can get it done. Haynes King's a good quarterback, but I just think you're really taking away the most dangerous element of your offense and really just making yourself too one-dimensional. So I think he's got to have a pretty big game on Saturday.
Maybe I don't really like to use statistics as like a telltale sign this early in the season, especially when you factor in competition. But with games against Florida State and Syracuse, I think it's a little bit more justifiable. I look at Haynes King early on, and last year he had the breakout season, but 16 interceptions. The decision-making was very subpar, to say the least at times. But this season, the average of completion has gone up by over a yard. He has 6 touchdowns to just 1 interception. He's completing – what is it, like 70 something percent of his pass? Yeah, 76.4% of his passes. Now, will that number stay that way? Probably not, but it looks good right now. What's the difference with him? Is it more so just better reads, better decisions? Because it's not like they're throwing the ball shorter down of distance. It just looks like Haynes King is just getting better.
I think it is better decisions, and I think it's so a lot of his interceptions. Like, I know 16 sounds like a lot. They all came in like 4 games. Like, he threw a ton of interceptions, like just a short amount of games. Like, I know he threw 4 against Clemson. He threw like 2 against Miami. He threw like 4 against Boston College. Like, it was and I think a lot of it was because in some games Georgia Tech got down, like the Bowling Green loss. A lot of people remember the Bowling Green loss last year. He threw quite a few after Tech got down kind of big and had to force some things. So when he is forcing things and it's not as smooth running, I think that's when he got into some trouble last year, but they just haven't done that this year. Now they're not perfect on every offensive drive. Like they've allowed some havoc in the backfield, especially in the past couple of weeks, where they've allowed some penetration and some tackles for loss. But he's not under duress a lot of the time, and I think that the offensive line is keeping him well protected, and he's not feeling like he's not forced into bad decisions. Is what I'm trying to say. So I just think a lot of it's better decision making on his part.
Well, this is definitely going to be a tall task to be able to contain Haynes King this Saturday. Probably the number 1 key for the Louisville Cardinals. 3:30 kickoff at Cardinal Stadium. ACC opener for Jeff Brum's team. We'll then now talk about the defense. A lot of questions surrounding the Georgia Tech pass rush. What went wrong in that Syracuse game, and also some players to watch for that we'll identify coming up on the next segment of Locked On Louisville. Today's title sponsor of the show is FanDuel. Like I said, Louisville opening up as a 10.5-point favorite over Georgia Tech on Saturday. And overall, you've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, if you've heard me talk a lot about it, you know that we have something a little different for you. Now through the end of this week, September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with the YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season game Sunday afternoon out of market contest. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. Just visit FanDuel.com to download America's #1 sportsbook. We're right back into now the final segment of this Tuesday edition of the show, going very, very quickly through Georgia Tech talk with Georgia Tech expert, publisher of Georgia Tech's Sports Illustrated site, and now I didn't know the host of Georgia Tech's Believe Network podcast, Jackson Caudell. Jackson, this defense, I want to go back to that Syracuse game. Truthfully, I've never been a huge Kyle McCord fan, and it looks like he's doing everything he can to just try to prove me wrong this season. What was sort of if you could limit it to one thing, what was the main reason why Georgia Tech wasn't really all that successful in containing Syracuse's offense?
They could not affect Kyle McCord at all. And that was a worry of mine going into the game. Now, I did pick Georgia Tech to win that game, but, I said several times, this is going to be no disrespect, DJU, but that passing attack stinks, and Georgia State is nothing. And so that was the first real passing attack you're going to see, and they failed miserably. They could not affect him at all. And I'll say this, he did get the ball out very quickly. He didn't spend a ton of time back there in the pocket, but whether it was Trevor Pena or Rondé Gadsden, they just found the mismatches, and they attacked up the seam, they attacked the middle of the field. It was pretty much everywhere, and their inability to affect him a lot, especially in the first half. Now, they did get a little bit better on a couple of drives in the second half. I think Tyler Santucci decided he wanted to blitz a whole lot more, and that could be something we see this weekend if they can't get home with their front four. But just their inability to affect him at all just really caused him to stay in a rhythm and just pick him apart.
Was that sort of an issue coming into this? Because you look at the stats. 5 sacks in 4 games. That's nothing that's going to jump off the page. It feels like, how would do you think that the secondary has the pieces to be good, or is it more so just the pass rush gives the opposing quarterback too much time to where at that point you're not going to stay marked on guys for long?
Yeah, they have 5 sacks in 4 games, and 3 of them were Saturday against VMI. So it has not gone well. I do think the secondary is pretty solid. Warren Burrell has one of the top coverage grades on PF in the entire country on PFF. Amari Harvey is a really talented player who's gotten better. I think the safeties with Clayton Powell-Lee, LaMiles Brooks is healthy now. They are good players. Now, they're not first-round picks or anything, but I think they are good players. I think it's just more of an inability. I just don't think they have a standalone pass rusher that can take over a game. Now, they brought in Romello Height, who started his career at Auburn, went to USC. Now he's at Georgia Tech, and he's played solid. I'm not saying he's bad, but they just cannot consistently get pressure at all. And that was my biggest concern coming into the year. And when they face strong passing attacks with strong offensive lines that can really you're giving quarterbacks a lot of time, I just think that's a bad matchup right now. And that could result in them having to blitz a lot more.
One thing that I really I hate that it's like this. It's like you have to take everything you saw at Florida State and almost put an asterisk by it because they just have not been good. And it's been the weirdest thing, but it is what it is. Syracuse really didn't try to run the ball all that much. Then VMI and Georgia State kind of hard to put too much into that. But in terms of the rushing defense, Louisville really hasn't – on offense, they haven't shown much. They've kept the playbook fairly vanilla. I'm convinced that they're going to open up the playbook and throw the ball more against Georgia Tech, but it's clear that they're still going to try to establish themselves on the ground with the running back committee that they have. How would you assess your thoughts on the Georgia Tech rushing defense heading into Week 5?
Better. There was nowhere to go but up. Let's be clear. So it is better. It's still. I don't know. Like it's better, but I still think there's a little ways to go. This was another place that they really went after in the transfer portal. Jordan Vandenberg from Penn State, Thomas Gore from Miami, Zeke Biggers is a guy who really has taken a step forward and is a leader there. Micaiah Scott, Kyle Eford is a really solid linebacker, and Trinidad Tatum's had a solid year as the other linebacker as well. Like he's racked up the tackles for loss, and the tackling has been a lot better because I'll go back to the Louisville game last year, in the second half when Jawar Jordan took that 70-something yard touchdown and just basically put the game away. Like that was some of the worst tackling you could possibly imagine. They haven't had anything like that outside of maybe the very first drive against Florida State where it looked just like last year. But again, like Georgia State is not a strong rushing team. VMI is definitely not. And then like Syracuse didn't want to run the football. So I don't know if they have a strong running attack or not. So this will definitely be a test for them. But I think it is improved for sure.
Couple more before we let you out of here, Jackson. Defensive player to watch. It could be for any justification. Who's the one guy that you feel like this guy has to be lights out if Georgia Tech wants to win this game?
I'll use the same player I said against Syracuse. It's got to be Romello Height. Like he has got to get to the quarterback and put pressure on Tyler Shuck. There's other guys that could do that as well, but I feel like he is the most talented edge rusher for Georgia Tech, and I think he's got to have a big game on Saturday.
That's fair. Romello Height. I didn't realize he spent last year with the USC as well. The guy is trying to make it to every conference before he gets out of college football. But no, I find that pretty interesting because I looked at that defense, and I know a lot about the Georgia Tech offense, but the defense, I really don't know much. Final question is, who wins and what's the score?
I think this is just a bad matchup. Now, there's a part of me that it's worried about picking against Georgia Tech because, again, like I said, Brent Key is 5-0 against ranked teams, and 4 of those wins have come on the road. He gets his team prepared for these games. I think that they are motivated to show that Syracuse game was a fluke and not indicative of who they are. I just think it's a bad matchup. I just don't believe in the pass rush for the Yellow Jackets, and I don't know that it'll be a whooping, I guess I could say, but I think it'll be 34-27 is probably where I would put it.
Are you putting that in favor of Louisville or Tech? I'm sorry.
Louisville.
Okay. And what do you think, I guess, second follow-up question is, if Georgia Tech loses this game, it's because why?
They can't stop the Louisville passing attack, and they can't force turnovers because that's another thing I haven't really touched much on. Is they haven't really forced a lot of turnovers, and when you can't affect the quarterback and force turnovers against good offenses, that's just a recipe for disaster. That's fair.
Well, the Cardinals, starting ACC play, Georgia Tech decided they wanted to basically get out half their ACC schedule before Louisville plays one game, which is very uncharacteristic. But you said are you coming to the game Saturday? Did you say?
Yes, I will be covering the game. It'll be my first ever trip to Louisville. I'm driving up on Friday morning, so I'm very much looking forward to it.
Okay, well, those that are listening to this on YouTube, be sure to drop some food recommendations for Jackson in the YouTube comment. There's some nice local places that we can recommend. Be sure to drop those in. That is the question of the day, by the way. Where should Jackson eat in his short stay in the 502? That's going to wrap up this Tuesday edition of the show. I'm Dalton Pence. He is Jackson Caudell. We'll see you right back here tomorrow. But most importantly, go Cards.